Okay, so just a quick review of the ideas that we went over in class today. We were looking at an introduction to R in the Jupyter notebooks. This is the notebook that's in your class that you were invited to. If you look in the files of that class, you should, within, we have this folder for November 6th, that's today. If I look in that, I have a notebook. Um, and I have some images and data and this PDF. Within this data folder, there's a bunch of different Gapminder data, including this 5-year data.csv that has just all of that some Gapminder data, the country, the year, the population, continent, life expectancy, and GDP per cap, and then the actual data for each country for these years, gives the population, and so on. So this is that data file, and what we're going to do is we're going to use R to read and manipulate that data. So we're going to start in the notebook by loading this tidyverse package. This has all of the functions that we're going to use to manipulate and investigate the data with, including the plotting package. So to execute a cell, we hold down Shift, hit Enter. You'll notice that the star is there. That means that it's working, and I can see that it worked by both. Now it has a 1 and it's loaded these different packages. Now that I have the tidyverse packages loaded, I'm going to use a function from the tidyverse called read_CSV, and I'm going to read this data file that I have sitting here in this folder called data into my notebook. So I say read CSV, and I tell it the folder and the file name, and it reads that data into the notebook. Besides for reading it in, I'm going to save it as a variable named Gapminder. So if I hit Shift Enter, this reads it in, and it tells me, yeah, it got it, and here are the columns: country, year, pop, continent, life expectancy, GDP per cap. It tells me what kind of data types these are, that this is a character or a name, that the year is an integer, population is a double or a real number, continent is a character, a name, life expectancy is a double or a continuous variable type, GDP per capita, double, continuous variable. I can look at the top of the data set with head. I say head Gapminder because, again, this is the Gapminder is what I called that data set. I can look at the bottom 6 rows of it, tail Gapminder, and I can get some information about further information about the column names and the variable types using this str command. This will tell me that it is 1704 observations of 6 variables. And here are my variables, and here are more information about each of those variables. For example, that the GDP per capita is double. That means a real number. Yeah. Okay. So again, this is loading the data, looking at just getting a peek at the top, the bottom, or the structure of the data. Next, what we want to do once we have our data loaded is that we want to manipulate it. So for example, our first task was to just select specific columns. Now if I look at my data set, I see I have these 6 columns: country, year, population, continent, life expectancy, and GDP per capita. Suppose I only want 3 of those. Namely, I just want the column called year, country, and GDP per cap. So I'll use this function called select, and this image shows you what selecting is doing. I can select from the data frame A and C, and it would just pull this column A and C from that data frame. So if I say select year, country, and GDP per capita, execute this, hold down Shift, hit Enter. Now if I look at the top 6 rows of this new variable that I've called year, country, GDP, I see it just has those 3. I've created this new variable that is only these 3 columns: year, country, GDP. It took and it grabbed 3 columns from my original data frame. Similarly, I may want to just select rows. rather than columns, I may be interested in rows. So, for example, a row problem would be if I'm looking for a specific value within one of these columns. Like if I want all of the rows that are year 1962, then rather than telling the computer select, I'm going to tell it filter. Again, the difference between select and filter is one is filtering columns, one is selecting columns. Select is just grabbing columns, and filter grabs rows. So if I select, if I say filter Gapminder, again, that's my original data set where year is the column name, has values equal to 1962, and I take a look at the head of that, yeah, sure enough, here are all the years 1962. I can add more complex filters to the rows. For example, if I wanted the years 1962 or 1967, then I can just add a vertical bar and that second criteria here, or 1967. And so if I now look at, again, I named that variable 60s, and if I look at the top rows of this, then I have the 60s, 62 and 67, 62, 67. Similarly, if I wanted just China's rows, I would use filter. Again, this is a row problem. I'm looking for within the countries that are named China. This is how I would accomplish that. Country, two equal signs, and in quotes because it's a name, China, and there I have all of my China countries. If I wanted to make a data frame with just the year, continent, and life expectancy, this is a column problem, so I'm going to use select. Tell it again, here's my data set that I want to select from, and here are the things I want to select, year, continent, life expectancy. And I'll name this year, cont, life, and if I add the head command to the same cell, it will do both of those at once and display me the resulting data frame. This year, continent, life, and there we go. If I want a data frame with the 70s instead of the 60s, this is a row problem, so I use filter, and it's what the rows I'm looking for are the rows that within the year column are either 1972 or 1977. And sure enough, if I look at the tail of this, I should have just countries from the 70s. Yep, that's what I have. If I want all of the data for Zambia, this is a row problem. I'm interested in this column, the country column, but only entries that are equal to Zambia. So I could make a Zambia variable. And again, the row problem is filter. From this data set, Gapminder, look at the column called country and give me only names that are equal to Zambia. And then show me just the first 6 rows of this variable that I created. Perfect. That's just Zambia and all the data for Zambia. Similarly, again, if I want country, continent, and population, this is a column problem. So I'm selecting from my Gapminder data the country, continent, and population, and I'm calling it country cont populate, country cont pop, this thing. And I look at the top 6 rows, sure enough, it just gives me back country, continent, and population. Finally, I can combine these operations. For example, if I just want the European countries and I only want the information about year, country, and GDP, well, then that's 2 things. First, I'm filtering the rows where the continent is equal to Europe, and then I'm selecting only 3 of the columns, right? If we look at our original data frame, we have country, year, population, continent, life expectancy, and GDP. If I don't want all of this, but I'm only interested in the data for Europe, then from the continent, first I'm choosing Europe, and then I'm selecting which columns I would like. So I can do this with a pipe, what's called a pipe, and I use this percent greater percent in order to push one command into another. So here I'm creating this variable year, country, GDP, euro. And the thing is I'm going into this gapminder data. I'm going to first, from that data, take the rows that are Europe. Again, I go into the continent column and just want things that have the name Europe. And from those, that's what this guy is called a pipe. From those, I'm just going to select the year, country, and GDP per capita. And again, if I look at the top of that, sure enough, I've got just European countries and only the year, country, and GDP per capita of those. If I wanted to change the problem, and maybe instead of Europe, I want to look at that. I want to look at Africa. Well, I would just go and I need to change the continent to Africa. Except I also need to change my variable name. I don't want it to be the year, country, GDP of Europe anymore. I want to change it to Africa. If you notice, I'm using underscores constantly in my variable names instead of spaces. It's bad practice to use spaces. The computer has a hard time if we name variables with spaces. It won't. It will only read it can't read spaces. It takes spaces as meaning something else. So I use these underscores to connect what we might use spaces for. But again, here I'm the year, country, GDP for Africa. I go to my data set, gapminder. Then from that, I pipe the filter command, and I just want to filter from the continent column continents that are African. I push that into my select, so I don't want all the columns. I just want year, country, and GDP per capita. And if I look at, again, the head of that, well, sure enough, year, country, and GDP per capita. Okay, so the important takeaways are how to load data using the read underscore CSV file, and how to look at the top and bottom, get a peek at the data with the head and string command, and also to filter and select data based on row and column criteria. All right, if you can understand this and alter it to select different information, you should feel good. Okay, that's what our assignment for this next class is going to be.